The Australian Transport Safety Bureau has published its final report into the collision with terrain involving a two-seat Aquila training aircraft, which occurred at the Cooming Park airstrip south of Orange, New South Wales on the 4th of November 2020. From its investigation, the ATSB is encouraging all pilots, when flying into unfamiliar or uncertified aerodromes, to carefully consider if touch-and-go operations are feasible and to conduct full-stop landings and a standing takeoff if unsure. Departing from Bankstown Airport on a training flight with an instructor and student on board, the pilots flew to Orange Airport. After about 8 minutes on the ground, the aircraft then departed in the general direction of the township of Carcoar and the Cooming Park aeroplane landing area. Arriving overhead Cooming Park, ATSB tracking data showed the pilots conducted 3 nominally regular patterns around the Cooming Park's main runway, while contacting the property manager by phone requesting permission to conduct a touch and go. With permission granted, the pilots positioned the aircraft to land on runway 07. After an uneventful touchdown and landing roll, flight data indicated that during the initial climb after the touch and go, the aircraft tracked generally in a straight line. However, as the aircraft climbed through 200 feet above the liftoff point, a climbing left turn was conducted before flying straight in the direction of a small dam, beyond which was less wooded area. Passing over the small dam, the aircraft collided with an embankment on the far side, in an upright attitude. Tragically, both pilots were fatally injured and the aircraft was destroyed. Accident site and wreckage examination did not identify any aircraft defects or anomalies that might have contributed to the accident. During the collision, the aircraft rotated in a counterclockwise direction, coming to rest facing towards the southwest about 180 degrees to the direction of travel. The ATSB's investigation found that pre-flight planning was likely not performed to identify that the Cooming Park ALA was suitable for flight training operations. This placed more importance on the conduct of the precautionary search to identify the rising terrain hazard in the overshoot area of the runway. The precautionary search was conducted at a height and position that likely made assessing the hazard less effective, contributing to the pilot's decision to conduct a touch and go towards rising terrain beyond the runway end. Further, the touch and go was conducted on an uphill slope with a probable tailwind. A standing takeoff in the more favourable reciprocal direction would likely have cleared all obstacles and terrain. Investigator in charge, Senior Transport Safety Investigator Dr. David Wilson, explains.
So let's take a look at the runway where the aircraft took off from. So you can see the green grass strip of Cooming Park here, and the red dashed line showing the flight track of the aircraft. Importantly, the actual takeoff occurred here, around 950 metres along the runway, after a normal touch and go. After this point, you can see that the aircraft tracked in between these trees, and we think potentially at a similar height to the canopies, which may have affected the pilot's decision to track that way. So let's take a look now up the hill in the direction that the pilots were facing. And this photo is taken from a similar height to where we think the pilots may have been. And so you can see this red dotted line is showing the track up the hill where the aircraft would have gone if it had continued in a straight line. And the red arrow is showing where the aircraft actually went and sadly ended here. And we now know that from this point, there were no escape routes available to the pilots in any direction. So now let's have a look from the perspective, a side-on perspective of the flight, looking at the aircraft climb up towards this mountain. So you can see the dark green is indicating the terrain, and the lighter shades of green are showing the typical tree canopy heights in the area. And this red dotted line representing the projected flight track is going into the tree canopy. And so you can see in this case that the pilots wouldn't have been able to outclimb the terrain. And that's why they made the decision to turn left. And that happened around this point. But the ATSB did calculations looking at if a standing takeoff was conducted instead of the touch and go. And so we did that by considering earlier parts in the flight and aircraft performance characteristics. And we determined that if a standing takeoff was conducted from the beginning of the runway here, that the aircraft would have become airborne earlier along the runway in this area, at least 93 metres before the actual touch and go. And this had the effect shown by this blue band here. And so this is showing the worst case and best case scenarios for if a standing takeoff was conducted. And so this is showing that if that was done, the aircraft would have actually been able to fly away, not by much, but with sufficient margin to maintain our flight.
As part of the report's safety message, Dr. Wilson emphasises that the liftoff location following a touch and go is more variable and complex to predict than a standing takeoff.
So in this case, we found that the touch and goes conducted during the accident flight were consistently longer and used more runway than if a standing takeoff was conducted. And sadly, this translated to the aircraft not being able to outclimb the rising terrain. Whereas if a standing takeoff was conducted, we're confident that the aircraft would have been able to fly away. And so one of the reasons for this is that the touch and goes are, they're more complex than just a takeoff and a landing combined. You've got additional factors such as you might have float during the flare, wind conditions, gusts and things like that. There's also the time to reconfigure the aircraft. And we actually saw this in the flight data. And so I think one of the really take-home messages from this is that pilots flying to unfamiliar locations where there hasn't been a full survey conducted and a full assessment shouldn't do touch and goes, shouldn't do circuit operations at unfamiliar aerodromes. And instead, they should do standing takeoffs. So another thing that we found in this investigation was that it's likely there was no pre-flight planning for the landing conducted at Cooming Park. And although the flight proceeded normally up until that point, and we would have expected to see the precautionary search in the flight, we didn't expect to see the touchdown. And the reason for that is it wasn't approved by the flight training school's procedures. One of the reasons we think this might have happened is a last-minute decision to land. And the evidence for that was a phone call late in the piece seeking the approval, and that was the first contact. So it might have been a change of mind after the pilots have assessed it and thought that the runway was suitable for use. Another really important thing that we found was that although Cooming Park wasn't approved for use by the operator, it could have been. And all that was required was for it to be listed in the En route Supplement Australia. And if it was there, then it would have been approved by the flying school's operating procedures, and the accident would have occurred in the same way. So it's important for flying schools and aircraft operators to realise that just because an aerodrome is in the ERSA doesn't make it safe for use. Operators should also be aware of new CASA guidelines that have been released, Advisory Circular 9102, and this replaced CAP 92. And the big difference for this accident between those two documents is that instead of requiring an assessment out to 900 metres, the new guidelines require pilots to assess from the point of takeoff all the way up to a safe flying height.
You can read the final report by searching AO-2020-059 on the ATSB's website, or from the link in the description below.